1928. Lenox Avenue, Harlem. A white gangster from the Bronx looked at a map of Manhattan and decided he wanted something that didn't belong to him. What happened next would test whether black economic independence could survive when organized crime's most ruthless operator decided to take it by force. According to later accounts from people who lived through this period, the conflict didn't start with violence. It started with a simple question that had no good answer. This is Episode 4, The Dutch Problem. By 1928, Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson had built something remarkable in Harlem. The numbers operation they'd developed over 6 years employed hundreds of African-American workers, provided financial services to thousands of residents, and generated enough profit to sustain a significant portion of Harlem's economy. But success, particularly black economic success in 1920s New York, attracted attention. Arthur Flegenheimer, known to everyone as Dutch Schultz, was 30 years old in 1928. He'd built his reputation running bootleg beer operations in the Bronx during Prohibition. He was calculating, ruthless, and remarkably efficient at turning criminal enterprises into profit-generating machines. According to later accounts, Schultz had been watching Harlem's policy operations for at least 2 years before he made his move. He understood the mathematics. Tens of thousands of African-American workers betting nickels and dimes daily generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual profit. The overhead was manageable. The risk was relatively low compared to bootlegging or other Prohibition-era rackets. There was just one problem. Black operators like St. Clair, Casper Holstein, and others controlled the infrastructure. They'd built the networks, earned the community's trust, and knew how to operate in Harlem in ways that white gangsters from the Bronx didn't. Schultz's solution was characteristically direct. He would force them into partnerships he controlled. They could continue working, but as employees rather than owners. The profits would flow to him, and they would receive whatever percentage he deemed appropriate. And if they refused, he would use systematic pressure, economic, political, and when necessary, violent, until they either submitted or were destroyed. The first approach, according to people who worked in St. Clair's organization, came in early 1928. Schultz didn't come himself. He sent representatives, well-dressed men who spoke politely, but carried an unmistakable threat beneath their words. The meeting was professional. They explained the benefits of cooperation, protection from other competitors, access to political connections, the ability to operate without constant police harassment. But the cost was clear. St. Clair would no longer own her operation. She would manage it for Schultz, with him taking the majority of profits and making all strategic decisions. St. Clair, according to accounts from people present, listened without interruption. When they finished, she refused, not angrily, not emotionally, simply, clearly, and with complete understanding of what that refusal would mean. The representatives, according to later accounts, weren't surprised. They'd made the same offer to other Harlem policy bankers. Some had accepted immediately, others had refused initially, but changed their minds after experiencing what happened to operators who said no. They told St. Clair she should reconsider. Think about what was in her best interest. Understand that Mr. Schultz was a reasonable man, but his patience had limits. Then they left. Bumpy Johnson, who was 23 years old and serving as St. Clair's chief enforcer and strategic advisor, understood immediately what would come next. According to later accounts, St. Clair and Bumpy spent the days following that meeting, preparing for a conflict neither of them wanted, but both knew was inevitable. They faced a difficult reality. Schultz had more men, more money, more political connections, and fewer moral constraints about how he used all of those advantages. The only assets they had were knowledge of Harlem, community support, and the willingness to make the conflict expensive enough that Schultz might eventually decide it wasn't worth the trouble. It wasn't much, but it was what they had. The pressure began gradually. According to accounts from policy runners who worked during this period, Schultz's men started appearing in locations where St. Clair's operation collected bets. At first, they just watched, standing on corners, sitting in restaurants, making their presence known without doing anything that would attract police attention or community backlash. The message was clear. We're here. We're watching. We can reach you anytime we want. Then the watching turned into conversations. Schultz's men would approach policy runners, offer them better pay to work directly for the Schultz organization. Some accepted. Others refused out of loyalty to St. Clair. The ones who refused started experiencing problems. According to later accounts, runners would be stopped by police on obviously fabricated charges. Their policy slips would be confiscated. They'd spend a night in jail, and when they were released the next morning, charges would mysteriously disappear. The message: Schultz owned the police. He could make your life miserable whenever he wanted. Other runners reported being followed home, nothing threatening said. Just men making sure you knew. They knew where you lived, where your family lived, which route you walked every day. Some runners quit. Others switched to working for Schultz. A core group remained loyal to St. Clair, but the pressure was taking its toll. By mid-1929, according to policy bank operators from that era, the economic pressure intensified. Locations that had hosted policy operations for years suddenly faced building inspections. Fire code violations that had been ignored for decades became grounds for closure. Health department citations appeared for businesses that had operated without problems for years. All of this, according to later accounts, traced back to Schultz's political connections. He'd spent years cultivating relationships with Tammany Hall operatives, police captains, and city officials. Now he was using those relationships to strangle St. Clair's operation through seemingly legitimate means. St. Clair fought back the way she always had, through the courts and the press. She filed lawsuits challenging the sudden enforcement actions. She gave interviews to the Amsterdam News and other black newspapers, explicitly naming Schultz and documenting the attempted takeover. She used every legal tool available to expose what was happening. But legal battles take time, and Schultz wasn't waiting. According to accounts from people who lived through this period, the violence began in late 1929. It started small. A policy runner beaten on his way home. A policy bank vandalized overnight. Nothing that would generate major police attention, but enough to send a message. Bumpy Johnson, who had spent 6 years learning from St. Clair how to think strategically rather than reactively, understood that responding to each individual incident would be a mistake. Schultz was testing them, seeing how they'd react, looking for patterns in their defensive strategy that he could exploit. According to later accounts, Bumpy's response was calculated. He didn't retaliate immediately. He didn't launch random counterattacks. Instead, he focused on making specific locations and operations so difficult for Schultz to target that the cost of the campaign would exceed its value. He increased security at key policy banks. He changed collection routes unpredictably. He moved operations to different locations without warning. He made sure that every attack Schultz launched required significant planning and resources while yielding minimal results. It was a war of attrition. And the question was whether St. Clair's organization could outlast Schultz's patience. Through 1930, according to accounts from both sides of the conflict, the violence escalated gradually. Individual incidents became more frequent. Policy runners were attacked with increasing aggression. Policy banks were targeted more systematically. The attacks weren't random. They followed a pattern designed to make operation progressively more difficult. According to police records from this period, several people connected to the numbers operations were injured seriously enough to require hospitalization. The incidents were reported as robberies or random assaults, but everyone in Harlem understood what was really happening. St. Clair's organization fought back. According to later accounts, Bumpy organized a defensive strategy that made every attack costly for Schultz. When Schultz's men targeted a location, they'd find it defended. When they followed runners, they'd discover they were being followed themselves. When they vandalized property, they'd face consequences that made the next attack harder to plan. The community, according to accounts from Harlem residents during this period, largely supported St. Clair's resistance. This wasn't just a conflict between criminal organizations. It was a fight over who would control black economic independence. St. Clair, for all her illegal operations, employed Harlem residents, paid them fairly, and reinvested profits in the community. Schultz was an outsider who wanted to extract wealth while giving nothing back. That community support translated into intelligence. Harlem residents reported when they saw Schultz's men entering the neighborhood. They provided warnings when attacks were being planned. They made it clear that Schultz wasn't welcome. But community support couldn't stop determined violence. According to accounts from early 1931, the conflict reached a new level of intensity. In March of that year, according to police records, a policy runner named James Wilson was shot outside a Lenox Avenue policy bank. He survived but spent weeks recovering. The shooting was attributed to Schultz's organization, though no arrests were made. In May, according to later accounts, a policy bank on 135th Street was firebombed overnight. No one was injured, but the damage was significant. Again, no arrests. The message from Schultz was escalating. This wasn't just economic pressure anymore. This was a clear statement that he was willing to use serious violence to achieve his goals. St. Clair, according to people close to her during this period, faced an impossible choice. She could continue resisting, knowing that the violence would likely intensify until people were killed. Or she could surrender her independence, accept Schultz's terms, and watch everything she'd built become someone else's property. There was no good option, only the choice of which bad outcome she could accept. According to later accounts, she made her decision in a private meeting with Bumpy Johnson in June 1931. They would continue fighting, not because they thought they could win in any conventional sense, but because surrendering would mean the end of black economic independence in Harlem. It would set a precedent that white organized crime could take whatever it wanted from black communities, and there would be no resistance. The question wasn't whether they could beat Schultz. The question was whether they could survive long enough for circumstances to change. Criminal organizations had enemies. Police had quotas. Politicians had elections. Nothing was permanent in the underworld. If they could hold out, if they could make the conflict expensive enough, complicated enough, problematic enough for Schultz's other operations, there was a chance he might face challenges that would force him to negotiate or withdraw. It was a long shot, but it was the only strategy available. Through the summer and fall of 1931, according to accounts from that period, the conflict intensified further. More policy runners were attacked, more locations were targeted. According to later accounts, at least 3 people connected to the numbers operations died in incidents attributed to the conflict, though police records classified them as unrelated crimes. Each incident hardened both sides. Each attack provoked a response. Each response justified further escalation. The pattern, according to people who observed it, followed a brutal logic. Schultz would target a location or individual. St. Clair's organization would respond with defensive measures or strategic counteractions. Schultz would escalate. The cycle would repeat. What made this conflict different from typical gang wars, according to later accounts, was the strategic discipline both sides maintained. This wasn't random violence. Every action served a purpose. Every target was chosen deliberately. Both Schultz and St. Clair understood that undisciplined violence would bring police crackdowns that would hurt everyone, so the violence stayed controlled, targeted, strategic, but no less dangerous for that control. Bumpy Johnson, now 26 years old, found himself leading a defensive war that had no clear end point. According to people who knew him during this period, the conflict changed him fundamentally. The strategic thinking St. Clair had taught him was being tested in the most brutal way possible. Every decision had life or death consequences. Every miscalculation cost someone their safety, their livelihood, or potentially their life. He learned to sleep lightly, to change his routine constantly, to trust fewer people and verify everything, to think not just about the immediate threat, but about threats 3 moves ahead. The teenager who'd arrived in Harlem 13 years earlier wouldn't have survived this. The street enforcer who'd worked for Bub Hewlett wouldn't have lasted a month. Even the strategic operator St. Clair had been training might have been overwhelmed. But the man Bumpy was becoming, the one forged by 6 years of education under St. Clair and now tested by warfare with Schultz, was different. He learned, according to later accounts, how to read patterns in chaos, how to anticipate moves before they happened, how to position resources where they'd have maximum impact with minimum exposure. Most critically, he learned how to maintain organizational cohesion under extreme pressure. When people were afraid, he had to project confidence without seeming reckless. When violence escalated, he had to respond proportionally without losing control. When loyalty wavered, he had to reinforce it through action rather than words. Leadership, he was discovering, wasn't about being the toughest or the smartest. It was about being the person others believed could navigate impossible situations. But he also learned something critical during this period, according to later accounts. Violence wasn't just about who could hit harder. It was about who could sustain the conflict longer. It was about who had more reasons to keep fighting. It was about whose organization could maintain cohesion under pressure. And on those measures, despite Schultz's superior resources, St. Clair's organization had advantages. They were defending their community, not trying to conquer someone else's. They had community support that Schultz couldn't replicate. They knew the territory intimately in ways Schultz's men didn't. And they were fighting for economic independence, which meant more than money. It meant dignity, autonomy, and the right to control their own fate. Those weren't small advantages. In a war of attrition, they might prove decisive. The community support, according to accounts from Harlem residents during this period, was particularly significant. When Schultz's men entered certain neighborhoods, word spread within minutes. When they met with local business owners, those conversations were reported. When they planned operations, St. Clair's organization often learned about them before they happened. That intelligence network didn't stop attacks, but it made them harder to execute successfully. It allowed defensive preparations that reduced casualties and property damage. It turned what should have been surprise operations into anticipated moves. Schultz, according to later accounts, grew increasingly frustrated with his inability to crush St. Clair's resistance. He'd successfully taken over operations in other parts of the city using the same methods. But Harlem was different. The community dynamics, the organizational resilience, and the determination of St. Clair and Bumpy to resist created complications he hadn't anticipated. By late 1931, according to later accounts, the conflict had reached a stalemate. Schultz had made life difficult for St. Clair's operation, but he hadn't forced her to surrender. St. Clair had absorbed significant pressure, but she was still operating. The violence had claimed casualties on both sides, but neither organization had collapsed. Everyone involved understood that the conflict was far from over. If anything, it was likely to get worse before it got better. But something else had happened during those 3 years of escalating pressure. Bumpy Johnson had proven himself not just as an enforcer or strategic advisor, but as a leader capable of organizing resistance against a vastly more powerful enemy. According to accounts from people who worked with him during this period, Bumpy's reputation throughout Harlem shifted. He wasn't just St. Clair's general anymore. He was becoming recognized as a power in his own right, someone who could defend community interests against external threats. That reputation would serve him for the rest of his life. The war with Dutch Schultz would continue for years. It would get bloodier. More people would die. The stakes would get higher, but the foundation had been set. Bumpy Johnson had shown that resistance was possible, that black economic independence could survive when someone was willing to defend it strategically, ruthlessly, and with complete commitment. Whether that was worth the cost, whether the violence and death that would follow was justified by the principle at stake, was a question with no easy answer. According to people who lived through this era, they did what seemed necessary at the time. They defended what was theirs. They refused to surrender to an outside force that wanted to take everything they'd built. History would judge whether that was heroism, stubbornness, or something more complicated. But in 1931, standing on Lenox Avenue, watching the conflict escalate toward what everyone knew would be all-out war, Bumpy Johnson understood something fundamental. This wasn't just about the numbers game. It wasn't just about money or territory or criminal operations. This was about whether black people in Harlem would control their own economic destiny or whether that control would be taken by force. And he had chosen his side.